Police officers who have arrested other police officers. What's the story? I was the head of the unit dealing with child protection. We served a number of police precincts, called a cluster. A young woman was arrested for theft at one of the police stations that resorted under us. Her mother was the complainant. The daughter had a serious substance problem and had previously stolen from her mother, who gave her a last warning after the second to last time. A substantial, for them, amount of cash had gone missing, and when confronted by her mother, the daughter denied any knowledge of it. So deciding that it was time for tough love, she took her daughter to the police station, opened a case, and had her arrested. Later that evening, the mother discovered that instead of hiding the money in the inside pocket of the coat, which was hanging in her wardrobe, she had inserted the envelope containing the cash into the coat sleeve. In other words, no theft had taken place. She immediately returned to the police station, explained to them what had happened, made a withdrawal statement, and was told her daughter would be released imminently. But because the case docket was already with the detectives, only they could release her, and not the unformed police in the charge office. Enter the rotten apple of a detective. Upon hearing that a withdrawal statement had been made, he booked the suspect out of the cells and took her to his office, where he told her that he could make the case go away if she did something nice for him in return, following which he had her released from custody. Only upon returning home and hearing her mother's profuse apology did the daughter realize what had happened. Cue the complaint, the case docket of which ended with me. Long story short, we summarily arrested the detective, a seasoned veteran of more than 15 years of service, recovered the used rubber in his office, and he was convicted. I don't remember the exact sentence, but it was in excess of 10 years. I forgot to mention something that really struck me. How quickly the arrested cop became institutionalized. There are certain mannerisms which convicts have which are hard to accurately explain, but easy to spot when you look for them. It's in the way that they walk. The gait is affected by leg irons, so after a while, even when not wearing them, one can spot it when they walk. Especially when in a hurry, there's something identifiable in how they move faster using small steps. I'm not sure I can explain it better, but I was shocked to see that after only 3 months in detention awaiting trial, some of the traits were already setting in. And that was only one of the things he was caught for. And can you imagine the terrible things he wasn't caught for in those 15 years? Story 2. Not a cop, but a former dispatcher who filed a complaint against another dispatcher for jeopardizing public and officer safety. This person did not like me. I would intentionally withhold information and not enter it into CAD, causing me on the radio to have delays in responding to officer questions. When I finally had enough and reported this person to the assistant chief, I was sent home. 2 days later, I was fired for abandoning my post even though I never left. I called both the chief and the assistant chief out during my termination for this being a case of good old boys and collected my personal belongings. To this day, people ask me all the time why is it when they call 911 at this particular city, they get told to hold. My response is usually that the dispatcher is most likely finishing their game of Candy Crush first. The thin yellow line, dispatchers, I hear the thin blue line, cops, are never to be crossed. You're either with them or against them. To those who say I should report it, at the time, yes, I should have, but I was devastated to lose that job and my only focus was to find a new job to keep money coming in. At this point, I do not know if the dispatcher is there anymore. I know the admins have changed with their retirements and mayoral appointments. There's a group mentality to being a dispatcher or a cop, but by and large, most do the work because they want to serve their communities. Being a dispatcher, even for my short time, is both the hardest and also one of the most rewarding things I've done. There are calls I'll never forget both for the sheer horror of them and also for the absolute insanity they brought forth. And please take a moment to consider that the person on the phone when you call 911 or emergency services rarely gets closure when you call. All too often, when we send out the appropriate people, that's the end for us. There are calls that shake you to the core and forever you wonder, did I do everything I could and are they okay? Story 3. I used to work for the police and arrested a few cops. First one was my first shift ever on the beat. I was walking around the city and had a complaint about a guy who was calling women derogatory names and yelling about how ugly they are. I wasn't too fazed. I thought he was probably just buzzed. As we walked over to speak with the guy, he started yelling about how he was in the right and we all agreed. You can have an opinion, but just keep things quiet. It was a very simple conversation, and after taking his details to issue a ticket, he just snapped. He threw his briefcase at my partner and kicked him in the junk. Well, we had a warrant for arrest, so took him down and cuffed him. As we took him down, his glasses broke and cut him up a bit. Nothing major, so we took him back to the holding cell. At this point, he said to me, "Did you know I have a 12-inch? And my real name is Joe Big Blow." We all had a laugh. I finally got some time to run his name through the system and boom. Police inspector. This is one of the highest ranks in VicPol. So being an inspector, I called my boss. She came in and said, "Oh shoot, this guy used to teach at the academy." Then he runs at her and tries to hit her. That doesn't go well and he ends up in the ground. After a few hours, he sobered up and was sent home. The court case carried on for 3 years. I've since left the force and he was fired shortly after that altercation. Story 4. Probationary officer goes on a blind double date with his roommate. They were at the racetrack drinking, so they took the train to downtown. Everyone is pretty buzzed, him in particular. Maybe to entertain or show off for his date, he's acting goofy. As everyone is getting off the train, he sees some guy bent over tying his shoes. Rocket scientist decides to leapfrog over the guy. Only neither of them have much balance. Probationary cop basically jumps over or on the guy and goes straight into the pavement because he's too buzzed and the guy wasn't expecting it. Everyone jumps up and he starts trying to defuse the situation he just caused. Turns out the guy is a kid heading down to spend the weekend with his grandparents and was injured. The cops start saying stuff like, "It's okay, it'll be fine. I'm a cop, it's all good." When he realizes the crowd isn't going to let him just walk away, he foot bails and tries to run off. A few guys chase him down and grab him. Cops get called and detain him. I was the on-call detective who was called out at 22:30 to handle the case. He refused to answer any questions and was booked and charged based on the extent of injuries and age of victim. He never made it off probation and resigned. I would clarify I wrote up and submitted the packet to the DA for prosecution. Nothing was swept under the rug. Trust me, a guy like this is not wanted by the police department. It was a probationary officer, so it would be easier to terminate him. The case was put through the system by the DA and he ultimately took a plea deal. A plea deal is very common across the entire spectrum of cases, whether it be vandalism, theft of $1 billion, substance charges, etc. It is probably the most commonly used tool for adjudicating cases. I don't think a plea deal was arranged because he had been a cop. Remember, he was arrested and charged by the same department he was a probationary officer for. He should have known people make dumb decisions when they're buzzed. Story 5. I actually have had to arrest 3 separate members of the justice system this year. First, a practicing lawyer and former judge who had been utilizing this position to coerce defendants. He utilized this leverage even after he was not a judge anymore. Investigation by DCI revealed he had about a dozen victims, so a warrant for his arrest was made, which I executed. Arresting a guy you used to put defendants in front of is a very odd feeling. He weaseled out of prison time and got it all suspended and put on a direct supervision probation program. Absolute BS. I've seen guys do way less and get away more time, but it's not really a secret that money has a habit of tipping the scales of justice. Next was a prison guard who hurt his girlfriend, then stalked her relentlessly. I actually arrested him twice because after he posted bail on the first one, he was spotted lurking outside her home only 45 minutes after being released. He's currently on multiple charges. He's still in my jail awaiting trial with a bail that has been substantially increased. I'm anticipating prison time for him, but only time will tell. Third was a city police officer. I'm the county deputy sheriff because we received a call from a kid that his dad was in the garage doing substances and wouldn't come out. Showed up to find 4 very young kids running around unsupervised. He was a city police officer smoking ice that he had confiscated during a traffic stop and not reported or turned into evidence. DCI took the case from us due to potential conflict of interest and have placed him in another county's jail, and I haven't heard any more about it. Hope he does time too. What kind of dirtbag leaves his little kids totally alone and unsupervised while they do hard substances, especially when said person is a freaking cop? Unforgivable in my opinion. But yeah, 2023 has been a very strange year for me. Story 6. Ex-sheriff's deputy here. One night on shift, I had the great misfortune to be overhear on the radio that a small local chief of police, the whole department was on 3 people, was not answering a radio call. So my shift partner goes out to the call that they were trying to get him to go to, and I make my way to try and locate this chief of police. On my way to the police station, thinking maybe he's just asleep on the couch, I see his squad car pulled off into the side of the road, lights going. In that moment, my heart sank. My first thought was, oh no, this dude just got ended in a traffic stop. As I'm walking up to the car in a hurry, I noticed that he's slumped over. I reached into the open driver's window and grabbed his shoulder to try and put my fingers against his neck to feel if he has a pulse or if his skin is still warm, and generally check to see if he is, in fact, still alive. As I'm doing this, I notice a distinct strong odor of alcohol. As the chief of police wakes up, looks at me, puts the car in drive, and pulls away. About that time, another deputy pulled up behind my car and I put out my radio that the chief was driving off. The other deputy, forgetting that we all use a shared frequency, then comes over the radio and says he should be easy to follow if his lights are on. The lights go off. Fast forward to several hours later, command staff are out at the police department, seizing the weapons and evidence that are stored within the department. This chief of police shows up with the mayor of the small town and submits himself to a breathalyzer. He barely passes. Fun fact, district attorneys do not like prosecuting chiefs of police, especially when politics are starting to get involved. Unrelated to that, I was let go about 2 weeks later for calling a suspect an a-hole. Unprofessional conduct. Seems like that is a really low level of termination for getting let go. The real reason would be retaliation for going after the chief. It was definitely an excuse for not being a team player. Oh, and since you're already halfway through the video, don't forget to click that like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Done? Now let's get back to it. Story 7. Not sure if it counts exactly as asked, but 2009. I've got a background in law enforcement, so as an Army officer recovering from combat injuries, I found myself as the operations officer for a post or base DES or Department of Emergency Services, which included the MPs and law enforcement for the post or base. My office was across the hall from the actual MP director's office. He stepped in and asked how busy I was. I was busy, but wanted an excuse to get away from the monotonous BS I was working on, so I said, "Screw it. What do you need, sir?" I was handling a case personally and wanted another officer as witness in documentation and processing. An officer's wife had been convinced to come in by a couple of other officers' wives. She was a mess, and even though she had cleaned herself up, she was hard to look at without just getting pissed. Female officers, of course, did the actual inspections and physical documentation, but the director was running the investigation himself. He had called the officer in off patrol and confronted him with me present as witness. Dude tried joking off that he had just gotten buzzed and a little out of control. Long 8-ish month story shortened, his case was transferred to civilian police department for her good. Not from reprisals or anything, for benefits. He was convicted of DV, which put him out of the MPs and lost him his ability to own or carry a firearm, so he was also discharged from the military, losing his career. I believe he also served some time in a civilian jail, but not 100% sure. She was granted a divorce, and because we sent it to civilian court, and he was not court-martialed, she still got to keep the divorced spouse married for over 10 years benefits for her and the kids instead of losing all benefits, which is why he was transferred to civilian department. I really liked that director. He did not tolerate BS from among his officers. Story 8. Saw a true crime video where this police officer offed his ex-wife because she was trying to divorce him and she had a really nice life insurance. He was struggling hella hard with bills, and apparently the crime split the whole police department up. People who thought he was guilty versus people who couldn't believe it and thought he wasn't guilty. In the end, he was caught because he was the only one who had keys to the car she drove, and the police found a paper with calculations on it, and that were how much he would have left over after the life insurance money paid off his debt in his house. Oh, and he was sleeping around with a coworker. Lol. Also, to add context on why the department was split, the side that was on his side were coworkers for years. They simply couldn't believe that someone they've worked along with could do that. He had a good rep at work, but at home he was different. Evidence, I said, was pretty much the last missing factor because the cops had a very hard time building a case because he covered his tracks really well. Plus, he made sure he had a strong alibi. He honestly would have gone away with it. In the beginning, he was helpful and gave as many statements as the cops needed, but the more evidence the cops were picking up, the more he started getting resisting and wasn't compliant anymore. It was actually very cruel towards her, but she was the main breadwinner of the house. She got tired of it and was trying to move on and settle the divorce as calmly and nicely as possible, but he wasn't complying. It got to the point he would break in at the house whenever he wanted, plus he would leave her recorded messages on the home phone. Since she was a nurse, she recorded all calls because sometimes her patients would call her and ask questions or whatever, but when the cops searched her place, they thought it was very weird how those tapes from his calls were missing. After all, he had a key. Plus, the crime was done in her work parking lot and his alibi was strong, but it seemed very plotted. On top of that, they did get confirmation he rented a van. The same looking van that the suspect jumped into after he offed her at the parking lot. Police couldn't trace the license plate because they were going off by the cameras from the car dealership. I'm pretty sure it was a car dealership across the street. It was too far to get a clear reading on it. Oh, and he had a very good reputation at work. He had a ton of circumstantial evidence against him. Your secrets will always catch up to you, in one way or another. Story 9. Not a cop yet. Yes, I know, but this is a hilarious story. The city police department had gotten their first internet computer in the early 2000s. One of the two female officers was having trouble with the computer. She had spent an hour screaming, hitting, and yelling at it before pulling her weapon out and aiming at the computer. The other female officer, who is my sister's future mother-in-law, had to take her down and arrest her for unlawful use of a service weapon and destruction of municipal property. The charges were dropped because she asked if she could instead quit without her pension and benefits and go to therapy. Now she's been living life as a grandmother and helping kids with anger issues. Another issue, more serious. An officer, same PD, was charged and convicted of unlawfully manufacturing and selling firearms. He was building rifles and pistols and was using a pawn shop to sell them. Because they had an FFL, Federal Firearms License, and was forcing the owner to sell him parts for a cheaper price, he was also found to be selling the substances he took off people. The police department has taken so many hits from these incidents that the city forces them to have multiple cameras in the cars. All officers have to have body cameras they can't turn off unless they're going to the bathroom, which they have to do in the department. They also can't have their weapons directly on them at their desks. They have to be locked in the safe next to their desk to deter them from pulling it out and aiming at a computer. I've decided not to work there and to find employment with a department that has a better reputation, which is sadly hard. I forgot to mention I added that the officers were female in the story because whenever the other female officer would say she worked at the department, people ask her if she's the one who blasted the computer and she has to explain to them the story. Story 10. Not a police officer, but similar story. My dad was diagnosed with stage 4 lymphoma. After his final round of chemo, he was in rough shape and was on a feeding tube. I moved up to NC in order to help him out for a few weeks and take care of him. He wasn't permitted to drive, and he could barely even walk. He was in such a rough shape, sleeping about 23 hours a day. One morning, I had to wake up early for his doctor's appointment. It's about 6:30 a.m., and I'm laying in bed while I hear a massive boom outside of his apartment complex. While I'm contemplating what happened, the noise happened a second time. I look outside the window, which has a direct view of the road. My dad's truck is all crooked in the parking spot, and I immediately get nervous. I quickly go check on him, and to my surprise, he's not in his bed. I run out to the living room and find him sleeping on a sofa. I quickly wake him up and start yelling at him, asking if he drove his truck. He couldn't remember, so we both immediately ran outside and found multiple vehicles completely annihilated. Keep in mind, his apartment complex runs on a loop, and there's one main road to get you through the whole place, and everyone parks on the main road. As we're outside, someone shouts, "He's out by the clubhouse," which is like 100 yards away from us. My dad can barely walk, no shoes on, we're both in our PJs, yet he scurries around to his pickup and finds his truck completely smashed all around his tailgate. Another truck nearby completely had his front end pushed in. We were all surprised because these are full-size trucks, and it's hard to do damage like that to a truck. We end up walking to a clubhouse where a severely intoxicated man is trying to buy a soda in the vending machine. We call the police, they show up, and we eventually find out there's 3 more cars completely destroyed one complex ahead of ours. Turns out he was incredibly buzzed and was on hard substances. Once the cops came, they wouldn't arrest him at first, so we started asking questions, and it turned out he was the captain of that local police force. They had to wait for the highway patrol to come arrest him. It was a crazy day. Well, if you like these stories, here's more. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. Catch you in that video.